program for students who basically can come and for about 6 to 8 weeks you learn through an online course that we have. You'll do readings and watch lectures, and then in July we do an online live session for about 3 days where you get to interact directly with the faculty and many of the scientists and scholars in the IB community. Dr. Miller and I both teach at that. We have quite a few folks here who are actually alumni of the program, so if you're interested, you can talk to Rune, talk to Richard, Dr. Jiang. There's other folks here as well who have been through the program. Martin, I don't know if Lentzer's here, Morris. We have a lot of folks here who have been through the program if you want to learn more about it. So go to this website and you can find out information about how to sign up. Okay, so let's talk about the origin of humanity. We've talked about the origin of life, we've talked about the evolution of life. Now we're going to get into where it really kind of comes home to the origin of human beings. And as I mentioned earlier, I did my PhD in geology at the University of Johannesburg. Now, my PhD research was not directly related to the origin of humanity. However, while I was living in South Africa, I had many opportunities to go to some very famous sites. For example, have you guys ever heard of the Cradle of Humankind in South Africa? Who's heard of that? Just out of curiosity. The Cradle of Humankind is a large region, just northwest of Johannesburg, maybe just a little bit southeast of Pretoria in South Africa, where they found quite a few hominid fossils. In fact, some of the best hominid fossil finds in the entire world have come from the Cradle of Humankind. And at the Cradle of Humankind, they have this museum called the Maripang Hominid Fossil Museum. It's one of the premier hominid fossil museums in the world. And I've been to this museum a number of times. In fact, we were just there a couple weeks ago while we were visiting South Africa. And I can tell you that the kind of view that they're going to promote there is the kind of view that you're going to get in the schools. And if you watch, some Netflix documentary, or if your kids are going to university, or you guys are in a public secular university, they're going to be taught the standard pro-evolution only view. The idea that humans evolved from ape-like ancestors, and that we share a common ancestor with living apes today. And it's taught basically as pure and unadulterated fact. There is no disputing the evidence. We evolved from ape-like ancestors. It is a done deal, okay? So you go to these museums and you find that they definitely have an agenda. In fact, you can even see here in this sort of a logo of this museum is that famous icon that shows, starting off with sort of stooped over early ape-like fossil and then slowly, gradually standing up more and more till finally it gets to modern humans. And this is a very powerful icon. It sort of conveys to people that we really have fossil evidence supporting the view that we evolved from ape-like ancestors. Well, what I want to say to you guys today is that actually, when you dig into the technical scientific literature and you find out what's really in the scientific literature, it does not support the idea that humans evolved from ape-like ancestors and that we share a common ancestor with apes. But again, while I was living in South Africa, I actually had quite a few opportunities to visit some of these hominid fossil sites. This is called the Sterkfontein Hominid Cave at the Cradle of Humankind, and this is actually a situation where I got to go and assist with doing some sampling at a cave at the Cradle of Humankind. I was helping to take samples so they could date the cave. I wasn't actually, going to do the research in the end in the lab, but I did go there and help collect samples. It was a lot of fun and had a great opportunity to do that. So anyway, we're going to do this lecture in 3 parts. We're first going to talk about hominid fossils. Basically, does the fossil record show that humans evolved from ape-like ancestors? Then we're going to talk about genetics and whether or not our DNA shows that we share a common ancestor with living apes. And finally, we're going to talk about the human mind and whether human psychology shows that we evolved by Darwinian evolution. But before we get into this too much, I want to talk about the evolutionary view. What is the evolutionary view of human origins? Well, back in 2009, I was working at Discovery Institute, and we were involved with a debate over how to teach evolution in the state of Texas. Texas is obviously a very large state, very influential across the entire United States as to how we're going to cover this subject. And at this debate they had before the Texas State Board of Education, there were scientists sort of on both sides of the issue. Some scientists said that we should teach both the evidence for and against evolution. Let students hear about both viewpoints, weigh the evidence, and make up their minds and learn critical thinking skills. This is what we thought that science education should do at Discovery Institute. We don't think that evolution should be taken out of the schools. We think it should be taught, but if you're going to teach it, you should teach it accurately, teach it objectively, teach both sides of the issue, and let students make up their own minds. However, there were a number of scientists on the other side who said basically we should only teach the scientific evidence supporting evolution, and we should not disclose to the students the fact that there are any weaknesses in evolution. And one of those scientists was a professor named Ronald Wetherington. Dr. Miller spoke earlier about the idea of theistic evolution. Well, he's a professor actually at a Christian university. SMU, of course, is Southern Methodist University. You would think it's a very, very strong Christian university. Well, for the most part, they are very, very hostile there at that university to intelligent design. So if you didn't believe Brian, that there's actually a lot of folks out there in this sort of Christian academic world who have fully gone over to the evolutionary viewpoint and are sort of like, that tiger that has been tamed. I think that Southern Methodist University is a prime example of a Christian university in the United States that has chosen to pose no threat whatsoever to the evolutionary paradigm, to go 100% along with that view. So during that day, when I heard these scientists testifying before the Texas State Board of Education, it was a very important hearing, a lot of news reporters were there, TV cameras, it was a really, really big thing. I heard this scientist say to the Texas State Board that human evolution has arguably the most complete sequence of any fossil succession of any mammal in the world. No gaps, no lack of transitional fossils. And he went on to say that human origins provides a nice, clean example of what Darwin thought was a gradualistic evolutionary change. So what he's saying essentially is that when we look at the hominid fossil record, what we see is a very gradual, slow evolutionary transition from ape-like ancestors into human-like species, and this is exactly what you would predict if Darwin's theory was true. He says that there are no gaps in the fossil record, no lack of transitional fossils, and we have basically a complete sequence of fossils showing how humans evolved from ape-like ancestors. Now, I was sitting there in the audience this day, and I was thinking to myself, okay, I have been studying this topic for a long time, and I know that there's more to the story than what he's saying. Now, I'm not accusing Professor Wetherington of lying or doing anything dishonest. I'm sure that he believes what he was saying, but what he was presenting to the public is what I would call sort of this dumbed-down version of evolution that's often given to the public. They try to present the issue as if all the problems are solved, there's no scientific weaknesses in evolution, there's no flaws, we got it figured out. If there are any questions, there are minor details. Never mind the details, okay? This is what is presented to the public. But I knew, because I had read the mainstream peer-reviewed scientific literature, that when you read the technical literature, you find out that actually they will often admit the fact that there are large unbridged gaps between ape-like fossils in the fossil record and human-like fossils in the fossil record. And this is a real problem, actually, for evolutionary models of how humans arose. So I knew that there was more to the story, and so I've really gone out of my way over the last few years to try to sort of make the public aware of what the scientific evidence really says on this topic. So to give you guys sort of, what is the evolutionary view? What does the evolutionary story of human origins say? Well, it starts off somewhere between, say, 5 to 7 million years ago with some of these early hominids. We're not going to have time to get into this right now. I actually have a much longer talk that goes into this in much more detail. And if you download that free ebook, you can actually get a lot more of my comments about the entire hominid fossil record. But you have some of these early hominid fossils, and they're very fragmented fossils. We don't have a very good idea of who they were or what they looked like or exactly how they lived. But they're said to be basically some of the first species. If you think of that progression, that ape to human icon, they're supposed to be some of the first species that were just starting to walk upright like human beings after the lineage that branched off and led to modern chimpanzees. But then, between 1.5 to about 4.5 million years ago, you get a different type of species called the Australopithecines. Now, the Australopithecines are an ape-like genus of hominids that are said to be directly ancestral to our genus Homo. If you guys remember back to maybe some high school science, what is the name of our species? Our species is called Homo sapiens. So we're genus Homo, species sapiens. We belong to the genus Homo. So the Australopithecines are said to be directly ancestral to our genus Homo. And we'll get into that in more detail. But then you have the genus Homo. And it turns out that many of the main members of the genus Homo, like Homo erectus, like the Neanderthals, are very, very similar to modern humans. So similar that, in fact, some paleoanthropologists have considered them to be members of our own species. They basically were essentially like humans. So we'll get into some of this in a lot more detail. But what we're going to talk about today is sort of this crucial transition from the ape-like Australopithecines into the genus Homo. And we're going to ask, is there evidence that humans evolved from these ape-like ancestors? And what we're going to see is that hominid fossils generally fit into two categories. There are ape-like species and human-like species with a large unbridged gap between them. And this is coming from the mainstream scientific literature. The fossil does not document the evolution of humans from ape-like precursors. That's going to be my position today. Now, before we get into this too much, I want to talk about the field of paleoanthropology. The field of paleoanthropology is the scientific discipline that studies the origin of humans by looking at fossils. And this field is fragmented in multiple ways. What do I mean when I say this field is fragmented? Well, first of all, the fossils themselves are fragmented. Second of all, the fossil record is very fragmented. And third, the field itself is very fragmented. So let's talk about this in a little bit more detail. Stephen Jay Gould, who's a very famous scientist, very famous paleontologist. He was at Harvard University until he passed away a few years back. But he said that most hominid fossils, even though they serve as a basis for endless speculation and elaborate storytelling, are fragments of jaws and scraps of skulls. So what he's saying basically is when you find a hominid fossil, usually what we get are just a few little bone scraps. If you find something like a pelvis or a femur or even a complete skull, you're doing really, really well. And that's very, very rare to find that. So the fossils themselves are highly fragmented. Here's another quote about how the fossil record is fragmented. This is a quote from Richard Lewontin, also a former scientist at Harvard until he passed away. He said, when we consider the remote past, before the origin of the actual species Homo sapiens, we are faced with a fragmentary and disconnected fossil record. Despite the exciting and optimistic claims that have been made a lot of time living in trees, she had probably a very arboreal lifestyle, and I think that this tells us something about maybe the way that she walked as well. There were other studies in mainstream scientific journals that talk about Lucy's pelvis. Now, the pelvis is a very important bone for determining whether or not you walk upright or not. And it turns out that when Lucy's pelvis was first discovered, the pelvis was badly crushed with distortion and cracking. And some people actually allege that there was error in the reconstruction of Lucy's pelvis. It was in such bad condition when they first found the pelvis, they actually had to do reconstruction on the pelvis. And this opens sort of up the question of whether or not that reconstruction was accurate. When scientists do reconstructions of these fossils, they're usually reconstructing them according to sort of a preconceived evolutionary idea about what that fossil species probably looked like. And I can tell you that in the case of Lucy, that definitely was the case. They were reconstructing her pelvis so that it looked more human-like than it may have actually been. And in fact, this article said that there was error in the reconstruction, creating a very human-like sacral plane. So basically, they did not reconstruct her fossil correctly. They made it look more human-like than it actually should have been. An article in the Journal of Human Evolution said that prevailing views of Lucy's posture are almost impossible to reconcile. To resolve such differences, more anatomical fossil evidence is needed, and it says that the available data at present are open to widely different interpretations. So what we see is that there's actually a lot of disagreement about the way Lucy walked. We don't have enough evidence to say for sure, but this much we do know. We do have a very nice piece of Lucy's femur, and from that you can see something called the bicondylar angle. The bicondylar angle basically tells you the angle at which the femur is going to go down from the hips down to the knees. And it turns out that in the Australopithecines, the bicondylar angle was actually much greater than it is in living humans. So when Lucy walked, she would have had a femur that actually probably pointed down at a much higher angle than ours does. So she probably kind of walked like this. Now, given that we know that Lucy spent a lot of time in trees and she had very long arms, you can almost imagine Lucy, holding on to a branch above her and then walking along tree branches. So yes, she could walk in a bipedal manner, but it might have been something that was more designed for bipedalism, walking in trees, than walking along the ground. Obviously, she probably did walk on the ground, but when she did that, she had the hands of a knuckle walker, okay? And so I think that we get some clues that she did not walk and live very much like a modern human. So there was an article in the Journal of Molecular Biology and Evolution a few years ago, and this article tried to describe whether or not there were transitional fossils leading from the Australopithecines into our genus Homo. And here's what the article said. It said, no gradual series of changes in earlier Australopithecine populations clearly leads to the new species. They're talking about the first human-like members of the genus Homo, and no Australopithecine species is obviously transitional, okay? So this is what I'm talking about. You have folks that are telling the public, oh, we've got it all figured out, the evidence is very clear, we evolved from ape-like ancestors, but then you look at the technical literature and you see a very different story being told. So there's a paleoanthropologist at University College London who said that Australopithecines are like apes and the Homo group are like humans. Something major occurred when Homo evolved, and it wasn't just in the brain. So let's talk about the origin of the genus Homo and what we see when our own genus evolves. We're basically talking about the origin of some of the first human-like species in the fossil record, and that would be like this species. This would be one of the earliest members of Homo right here, which really looked very similar to us. It might have even been, we could consider it a member of our own species. So if you look at the technical scientific literature, you see it talking about an explosion or a rapid increase or punctuated change. That means very rapid change and an approximate doubling of brain size at the appearance of Homo about 2 million years ago. And a study of the pelvises of Australopithecines and Homo found very rapid evolution corresponding to the emergence of the genus Homo. So we see sort of these statements in the scientific literature saying that when our genus Homo evolves, it appears very rapidly. It appears abruptly as an explosion or rapid increase. These are not the kinds of phrases that you want to see if you're an evolutionist. You want to see slow, gradual evolution, showing how these things evolve through transitional fossils. And yet that is not what we see when it comes to the origin of our genus Homo. Ernst Mayr was one of the leading evolutionary scientists of the 20th century. And he says that the earliest fossils of Homo are separated from Australopithecus by a large unbridged gap. And then he asks, how can we explain the seeming saltation? A saltation is basically like a jump in the record where things change very quickly. Well, he says, not having any fossils that can serve as missing links, we have to fall on the time-honored method of historical science, the construction of a historical narrative. I want you guys to appreciate what he's saying here. He's saying that we don't have fossils that can serve as quote-unquote missing links to explain how the genus Homo evolved from the Australopithecines. So instead, what is he going to do? He's going to construct a historical narrative. What does that mean? That basically means he's going to tell a story, okay? So he has a story about how humans evolved, but we don't actually have fossils that support that story. Here's another example of this. This is a chapter from a technical scientific book, and this was authored by 3 paleoanthropologists from Harvard University. And this is what they said. They said the transition from Australopithecus to Homo was undoubtedly one of the most critical in its magnitude and consequences. And then they say, as with many key evolutionary events, there is both good news and bad news. Okay, well, what's the bad news? First, the bad news is that many of the details of this transition are obscure because of the paucity of the fossil and archaeological records. Okay, so we don't know very much about this supposed transition because we don't have fossils documenting it. Okay, all right, fine. Well then, what about the good news? What's the good news? Well, then they go on to say, although we lack many details about exactly how, when, and where the transition occurred from Australopithecus to Homo, we have sufficient data from before and after the transition to make some inferences about the overall nature of key changes that did occur. So what are they saying here, you guys? Let me translate this for you. What they're saying is, the fossil record provides ape-like Australopithecines before, and human-like Homo after the supposed evolutionary transition, but non-actual fossils documenting a transition between them. And so in the absence of these fossil intermediates, we're left with inferences. We're just inferring the transition happened based strictly upon the assumption of evolution, not actually hard fossil evidence. I don't know how many of you guys were here this morning when I talked about that quote from Richard Lewontin, which said that we have to always assume in evolutionary science, we always assume that materialism is true. We leave no room for the divine foot to come through the door. Well, this is a good example of that. Even in the absence of any fossil evidence, they are inferring that the transition did take place because they're assuming that evolution is true. And I want you guys to appreciate and understand that this is basically what's going on in the evolutionary mindset in the scientific community, is that it doesn't matter what the evidence actually says, all right? They're going to conclude that evolution is correct. So the evolutionary paradigm is not necessarily the result of always careful analysis that's perfectly objective. It often is just an assumption that people will make, and they're going to assume it's true regardless of whether the evidence supports it or not. So getting back to this paper I cited earlier from the Journal of Molecular Biology and Evolution, to give you guys a longer sort of take on that quote, it's talking about some of the earliest human-like members of the genus Homo. It says, Homo erectus, or Homo ergaster, was significantly and dramatically different from Australopithecines in virtually every element of its skeleton and every remnant of its behavior. The changes are sudden. No Australopithecine species is obviously transitional. A radical transformation, in other words, a genetic revolution. Isn't this interesting? What they're saying is, when we look at the origin of our genus Homo, we see a radical transformation, a genetic revolution. Again, this is not what you want to see if you are an evolutionist. You want to see a slow, gradual evolutionary transition. And because of this evidence, there was actually a scientific commentator which said that this is like a Big Bang theory of human evolution. Again, this is not the kind of evidence you want to see if you're an evolutionist. So a fossil summary. The fossil record does not support the claim that humans evolved from ape-like ancestors. So what about intelligent design? Well, as we talked about earlier today, intelligent design helps us understand the origin of new information. But when we see papers talking about the need for a genetic revolution to explain how humans arose, that's talking about the need for large amounts of new genetic information to come into the biological world to allow this new type of organism, this new genus Homo, to exist. But where in our experience does new information come from? It comes from intelligence. So I think this is sort of a telltale sign. We see this radical new body plan appearing very rapidly in the fossil record. That is good evidence for intelligent design. Okay, so that's the fossil evidence. Now let's talk into the genetic evidence and talk about that for a couple minutes. How many of you guys ever heard of Bill Nye the Science Guy? I'm just kind of curious how far he gets around. Yeah, I mean, I've definitely watched Bill Nye. He's sort of this geeky science nerd. I used to watch him when I was a kid. He would tell you how to blow things up or how to do fun science experiments. It turns out he's also a raving atheist who thinks that parents should not be able to teach their kids to question evolution. But he wrote a book a few years ago titled Undeniable: Evolution and the Science of Creation. And in this book, he makes this very, very sort of common argument. He says, as our understanding of DNA has increased, we have come to understand that we share around 98.8% of our gene sequence with chimpanzees. This is striking evidence for chimps and chumps to have a common ancestor. So how many of you guys have ever heard this claim that we are 98 or 99% genetically similar to a chimp, and therefore we share a common ancestor with chimps? You guys ever heard this argument before? I'm sure many of us have heard this argument. In fact, just last month, I was at the Smithsonian Institution Museum of Natural History in Washington, D.C., and guess what it says? It says you and chimpanzees, 98.8% genetically similar. So we're going to ask to, yes, you're shaking your head, you know where this is going. We're going to talk about this. Is it true that we are 98.8% genetically similar to a chimp? And that's question one. Question two, even if we were, would it even mean that we share a common ancestor with them? So to answer the first question, is it true? No, it is not true that we are 98 or 99% similar to a chimpanzee. Back in 2007, very soon after they first sequenced the chimpanzee genome, there was an article in the journal Science, another one of the top journals in the world, which basically said that it is a myth to claim that we are only 1% genetically different from chimps. In fact, the article was titled, relative differences, the myth of 1%. And the article said that the 1% statistic is a myth and a truism that should be retired. And they noted that if you just assume, this 1% statistic, that still means that there are 35 million base pair, individual nucleotide base pair differences between humans and chimpanzees, as well as 5 million indels. An indel is basically a difference between the human and chimp genome that is 2 or more base pairs in size, as well as 689 extra genes in humans. And they noted that this 99% statistic pertains to only certain genes that are found in both humans and chimps that are so similar that you can line them up. But this only accounts for a very small percentage of our genome. And they did not look at many of the non-coding DNA sequences, the parts of the DNA that don't encode proteins, when they made this claim. So let's talk about the true percent genetic similarity between humans and chimpanzees. Some of our friends have done research on this question, and there was a paper that came out in 2020 that found that human and chimp DNA is only 96% similar. Now, this actually did not look at a special type of DNA called centromeric DNA. And there's no question that if they would look at that, that would lower the percent similarity between humans and chimps by a significant amount. Another study in 2018 said that we were 95% similar genetically to a chimp. And another study in 2018 by Richard Buggs, and I like this one a lot because what he actually did is he compared the two genomes and asked, where do we find the same nucleotide in the same position in both genomes? And so he was only able to find 84.38% genetic similarity when you consider directly matching nucleotides. So what's interesting though is that all current estimates of human-chimp genetic similarity are using versions of the chimp genome that actually use the human genome as a scaffolding when they built the chimp genome. You might think this is hard to believe that they actually used the human genome sort of as a template for building the chimp genome, but I didn't come up with this. I actually got this from the NCBI website, which is the main government biology website of the federal government in the United States. So they acknowledge that the chimp genomes are effectively humanized. They're more similar to humans than they should be because they used human DNA as a scaffolding when they built it. But let's just take the maximum difference here, or I should say the minimum difference here, the maximum similarity, and if we take that at face value, and you consider the fact that there are over 3.5 billion base pairs in the human genome, that still equates to 120 million nucleotide differences between humans and chimpanzees. Let me tell you, that is a lot of genetic differences, and that's plenty to encode many key and important genetic differences between our two species. But we still have to ask this other question. Let's say that we were 99% similar. Would that even mean that we necessarily share a common ancestor with apes? I would say the answer is no, because these similarities can be due to common descent, where we share a common ancestor, but they can also be due to common design. It's actually a very good design principle to reuse similar parts in different systems that can perform the same kind of function. So there's really no objective standard to infer common ancestry here. I mean, at what point would we say that common ancestry is false? If we're only, 1% different, 5% different, 10% different. I mean, some people have said that we're 50% similar to a banana, okay? So at what point is there actually like an objective standard to say that humans and apes don't share common ancestry based upon our percent similarity? The answer is there's no objective standard here. They're just making a very weak rhetorical argument. But I want to get back to this idea of common design, because I would say that even if we are 99% similar to chimps, that could be the result of common design. And again, it's a very good design principle to reuse similar parts in different designs. Engineers do this all the time. So for example, you will see wheels being reused in both airplanes and cars, or keyboards being reused on both tablets and cell phones. Just out of curiosity, have any of you guys ever done any computer programming? I had to write about 80,000 lines of Python code during my PhD. And I can tell you that computer programmers will reuse code all the time. We call it reusing, but it's really sometimes stealing code from other people. In fact, every version of Microsoft Windows was built using code from a previous version of Microsoft Windows. And that's not a bad thing. It's actually a good design principle to use coding modules that work in new programs. So why couldn't a designer finding a good design principle to reuse necessary genetic components that was needed to build a new type of organism using sort of a similar blueprint or a similar body plan from a different type of organism. I think this is what designers do, and the fact that we see similarities between different species could be the result of common design rather than common descent. But let's go back to that 4% statistic, and let's assume for a moment that we take this famous quote from Empire Strikes Back from Star Wars, where Darth Vader confesses to Luke that he's his father, okay? And what we're going to do is we're just going to change 4% of the words in this quote. What we're going to do is we're going to add 4 instances of the word not to this quote, all right? And you can see how just changing a small percentage of some text can radically change the meaning of what you're saying. So now it actually says, I am not your father. Search your feelings. You know it to be true, Luke. You cannot destroy the Emperor. He has foreseen this. It is your destiny. Join me, and together we cannot rule the galaxy as father and son. Come with me, it is not the only way. So you just change a small percentage of some text, and you get a radically different meaning to the text. And so I think that 4% difference, again, is plenty to encode many differences between us and a chimpanzee. So there's also many unique DNA sequences in the human genome. I won't go through this in too much detail, but there are thousands of unique sequences in our genomes that do not code for proteins. And these sequences actually are often involved in regulating gene expression and also involved even in controlling how the brains develop. So we see major differences in these two species, especially as regards their brains. So we're going to ask a question really quick. Is there enough time in the hominid fossil record to explain humans evolving from a common ancestor with apes when we consider all of the many anatomical and genetic differences between humans and apes? Is there enough time to explain this from evolutionary mechanisms? Well, chimps are basically adapted for life in the trees. Obviously, we did not evolve from chimps, but if we're going to talk about a common ancestor that might have been chimp-like, we have to talk about what changes would need to happen. Humans live on the ground, and we are adapted for walking and running. And there was a study in the journal Nature a few years back that asked what would be necessary to convert an ape-like ancestor into a human. And they found that many, many anatomical differences, many changes in the body structure would be necessary to convert this ape-like ancestor into human. This includes a new design of the spine, a new shape and tilt to the pelvis, legs that angle in from the hips, knees, feet, and toes that are designed for upright walking, a skull that sits on top of the spine in a balanced position, a shift in the jaw muscles and the muscle attachment points, and a face that's flattened and sinuses behind the face, and the eye sockets located in different places to permit a forward gaze. Remember that human chimp DNA has at least 120 million base pair differences, which encode these many anatomical differences. So the question we can ask is there enough time from the fossil record to explain how these differences evolved in, say, the 4 to 8 million years since we shared a supposed common ancestor with chimps? So this is actually a question that we can address mathematically. And there's a field of biology called population genetics. And this field basically tries to say, how do new traits evolve? How can we explain how gene frequencies can change in populations? And some of the relevant variables that they looked at when they will do these kinds of calculations is as follows. They'll look at the population size. They'll look at the generation time. They'll look at the mutation rate, and they'll look at the time available for the fossil record. If you're trying to explain how some new complex feature evolves, you want to have a large population, because that's going to give you many opportunities for those just right mutations that you need to arise in the population. You also need to have a short generation time. The shorter the generation time, the more species are going to live, and the more opportunities, again, you have for new traits to evolve. You also want to have a high mutation rate. The higher the mutation rate, the more opportunities for the right mutations to evolve. And you also want to have a long time available for the fossil record. The more time that's available, the more opportunities you have for the necessary mutations to arise. The problem is that when it comes to evolving humans from an ape-like ancestor, all of these factors are working against you. We have a very small population size. We have a very long generation time. We have a very low mutation rate, and we have a very short amount of time from the fossil record. We'll call it less than 10 million years since we supposedly shared a common ancestor with apes. Now, 10 million years might seem like a long time to you, but when you consider the fact that, every species, every generation is maybe 10 to 15 years, that's only a few 100,000 generations to evolve these tens of millions of nucleotide differences between humans and chimps, and also to change many anatomical features. So what this means is that evolution does not have very many rolls of the dice, quote unquote, to get it right, to get the right mutations necessary to evolve new traits in the population of early hominids. So what's interesting is that there were two critics of intelligent design in the journal Genetics. They were mathematicians from Cornell University. And what they did is they actually tried to critique the mathematics of Michael Behe, who said that there was too much complexity to evolve this very rapidly in the fossil record. And here's what they said. They said if you have to obtain a trait which requires just 2 mutations before giving you some evolutionary advantage, so very, very, very small trait, it only needs 2 mutations to be present before giving you some evolutionary advantage, then they said that for humans with a much smaller effective population size, this type of change would take over 100 million years, and they said that this is very unlikely to occur on a reasonable timescale. So what does this mean? If any of the 120 million base pair differences in our DNA that encode the many anatomical differences between humans and chimps, if any of those represent a trait that would require 2 or more mutations before providing an advantage, then that trait would be very, very unlikely to have evolved in humans since our supposed split with the apes. There are simply not enough rolls of the dice, not enough opportunities to get the right mutations you need to explain the evolution of humans. And again, what we're seeing here is something that reflects intelligent design. We are too genetically different to explain, there's too much new genetic information in humans to explain how we could have evolved by standard evolutionary mechanisms from a common ancestor that we shared with apes. I want you guys to appreciate what we're looking at here. What we're looking at actually is a direct mathematical refutation of the claim that humans evolved from ape-like ancestors by standard evolutionary mechanisms. Mathematically speaking, it is not possible that this is the answer for us. Okay, so let's now close this up, and very quickly we're going to go over human psychology and how this also points to the design of humans. So I mentioned at the beginning of this talk the Maripang Hominid Fossil Museum in South Africa that I've been to many times. When you walk into the main fossil hall of this museum, you will see this quote from Richard Dawkins, the famous atheist biologist, displayed in 2 very prominent places. In fact, one of these places, it stretches from floor to ceiling, and it's displayed 2 times. So they really don't want you to miss this quote. Here's what the quote says. "We are survival machines, robot vehicles blindly programmed to preserve the selfish molecules known as genes." What is this saying? It's basically saying this is a materialistic message which says that the purpose of human beings is nothing more than to survive and reproduce. Natural qualities that distinguish humans from the animals. Well, first of all, only humans use complex language. We also are the only species that uses complex tools and technology. We're the only species that uses fire. Only humans use clothing. Only humans can engage in abstract reasoning. Only humans practice science. Only humans do math. We are the only ones that compose music or write poetry and literature. Only human beings practice religion, and only human beings can engage in higher moral reasoning. So let's go through some of these very briefly just to talk about what some of the special qualities of human beings are. First of all, only human beings can use complex language. We're the only ones that use syntax and rules in our language. We use grammar, we use metaphors, we use analogies, we use complex recursive type of arguments and comments when we speak. It's very difficult to account for human language in terms of trying to evolve it from an ape-like precursor. In fact, MIT professor and linguist Noam Chomsky says that human language appears to be a unique phenomenon without significant analog in the animal world, and it says there is no reason to suppose that the gaps are bridgeable. So very interesting. It's very difficult to explain how humans evolved in their language from sort of animal ancestors. Another paper in the journal Frontiers in Psychology said that studies of non-human animals provide virtually no relevant parallels to human linguistic communication, and none to the underlying biological capacity. The most fundamental questions about the origins and evolution of our linguistic capacity remain as mysterious as ever. This is another great quote. This is from a Harvard scientist, psychologist named Steven Pinker. He says, "Human language is an embarrassment for evolutionary theory because it is vastly more powerful than one can account for in terms of selective fitness." This is kind of the main point here, that many of the capabilities of humans seem vastly more powerful, vastly more incredible than what would evolve if all we had to do was survive and reproduce and pass on our genes. It simply does not make sense to have all these advanced capabilities if all we have to be able to do is survive and pass on our genes. Okay, so what about complex tools? Obviously, you guys are familiar with many of these tools. Only human beings make highly complicated tools. Now, it is true that a chimpanzee might occasionally take a stick, put it in an anthole, and then lick the ants off, right? But that doesn't hold a candle even to some very simple human tools, like a hammer, or a bow and arrow, things that virtually every human culture uses. And of course, there are far more advanced tools as well, and only humans can produce the advanced technology, of course, that make our society possible. One of the reasons why we are able to have this advanced technology is because only humans can harness fire. Of course, this helps us to stay warm at night and to cook food and to basically, sit around the campfire and tell stories and jokes to each other. But fire is also what makes many human technologies possible. From just, making metal. All human cultures use metal, and that in order to do that, you have to be able to melt the metal using fire. And so human technology is made possible by our use of fire. Clothing. Clothing is uniquely something that humans wear. Now, of course, clothing is much more than just something to keep you warm. It's often an expression of your culture, or maybe your marital status, or your stature within a society, or your religion. There are many, many things that human beings will communicate and express through clothing, and it's really a very beautiful part of human culture, and only human beings do this. Only human beings engage in abstract reasoning. There have been studies of humans and apes, and although chimpanzees can have, really the only place that a chimp will beat humans out on intellectual activity is in terms of their memories. At a younger age, chimps have a much better memory than a human being, but they can't do abstract reasoning and they cannot think the way that we do. Humans are also the only species that does science. In fact, the next time that someone tries to break down the differences between humans and apes, remind them that it's humans who write scientific papers studying apes and not the other way around. So I think this is important to remember when people try to compare us to the animals. Mathematics. Only human beings use complex mathematics. Music. Music is a beautiful thing. It's used by every single human culture. But what does music have to do with survival and reproduction? If all you have to do, basically the idea is that the human mind evolved in Africa on the grasslands between somewhere in the last 1 to 2 million years, okay? If all you have to do is be able to find food and hunt and pass on your genes, why would we have music? This universal, beautiful human activity that allows us to creatively express ourselves, to worship God, to sing songs to your loved ones or whoever it might be, to tell stories to each other. Music is a powerful part of the human experience, but it really has no apparent connection to the mere requirement that we survive and reproduce. Same goes for poetry and literature. So much amazing truth is communicated through poetry and literature and philosophy, and yet it alone is done by humans. Religion. Religion is also universally practiced by all human beings around the world. It doesn't matter where you go. But what does this have to do with survival and reproduction? Well, some evolutionary psychologists will say, well, maybe religion helped give us group cohesion, where it helped people to cooperate better in groups, and that allowed them to better survive in a hostile environment. Okay, fine, maybe, but when you actually predict all the beautiful complexity of religion, worshiping God, praying, going off into the wilderness to fast and pray, devoting your life to a deity, changing the plans for your entire life because of what you believe God wants you to do, going into a monastery to pray, or a convent. Usually celibacy is not very good for survival and reproduction. And so why would human beings do this if it has no apparent evolutionary benefit? Yet all human cultures practice these beautiful activities where we devote ourselves to God or the gods, various religions around the world, and it is very difficult to account for in evolutionary terms. Moral reasoning. Bioethicist Wesley J. Smith says, we are unquestionably a unique species, the only species capable of even contemplating ethical issues and assuming responsibilities. We uniquely are capable of apprehending the difference between right and wrong, good and evil, proper and improper conduct, okay? So look, evolutionary biology claims that the human mind evolved on the African savanna and subsequent environments over the past 1 to 2 million years. If this is true, why do we do so many extraordinary behaviors and have so many abilities that seem far beyond what is needed to simply survive and reproduce in such an environment? Why do we do so much? So human exceptionalism. Who can tell me who these 3 people are? Anybody know who this is on the left? That's Michelangelo, who of course painted the Sistine Chapel, this incredible artist. This would be Albert Einstein, the physicist who discovered relativity. And in the middle here we have Oskar Schindler. I'll talk about him in just a minute. Each of these people did things which have no apparent survival value. Why is the ability to paint some beautiful painting or carve a statue, how is that connected to survival and reproduction, in some, primitive environment? What about Albert Einstein? If all we need to do is survive and reproduce, why do human beings have the ability to ponder the deep mysteries of the universe, to study science, to discover the secrets of physics and how relativity works? This has no apparent connection to survival and reproduction. And Oskar Schindler. Oskar Schindler was a German businessman who risked his life, he put his life at risk to save over 1,000 Jews from going to the gas chambers during the Nazi Holocaust in Nazi Germany. He literally did this incredibly beautiful act of selfless altruism and kindness to risk his life to save people who were not even part of his own tribe, not even part of his own kin. This is very difficult to explain in evolutionary terms because everything according to evolutionary psychology is done because it gives kickbacks to your selfish genes. So Francis Collins says, what we admire as the most generous manifestations of altruism are not based on kin selection or reciprocity. An extreme example might be Oskar Schindler risking his life to save more than 1,000 Jews from the gas chambers. And he says that's the opposite of saving his genes. So again, some behaviors that challenge Darwinian explanations. Why can we do these amazing scientific abilities? Why are we doing all these amazing artistic activities? Why are we composing symphonies, composing music? Why are we going and doing all these religious activities which often hinder our ability to survive and reproduce? Why do people do these extreme acts of selflessness that put one's own life at risk, especially for people outside your tribe or kin? And why do we have this universal moral code throughout humanity which values, respects, and praises these kinds of higher behaviors above all others? So for example, you guys, think of the man who died on the cross 2,000 years ago because he believed that his death would save his enemies, all right? Not only is it very difficult to explain that kind of a beautiful act in evolutionary terms, what I think is also even more difficult to explain is why is it that almost every human culture sees the death of Christ and sees it as one of the most beautiful expressions of human moral activities and human moral kindness. Everybody looks at what Christ did, even if they're not a Christian, and says, wow, that was amazing that he would die for his enemies. So we have this universal moral code which respects and praises and values these beautiful acts of selflessness. If humans evolve and everything we do is actually just programmed to help us pass on our selfish genes, I don't think we would have that kind of a universal moral code. So what this shows is that life is about more than just survival and reproduction. This challenges Darwinism and it shows that humans were designed for higher purposes. So thank you guys very much. We can chat more during the Q&A.